What began as a standard segment on the entire broadcast, a seemingly straightforward inquiry from Bill Maher to Scott Jennings regarding the legacy of the man he might one day replace, Mitch McConnell, rapidly disintegrated, the polite facade of political commentary shattered, and the conversation devolved into a furious, high-stakes ideological collision. This was not merely a debate, it was a raw confrontation between two irreconcilable worldviews, constitutional idealism clashing violently with uncut political pragmatism. In this conflict, Bill Maher appointed himself the enraged guardian of institutional integrity and procedural norms, while Scott Jennings stood firm as the unflinching, articulate apologist for the effective, if brutal, exercise of political ruthlessness. Bill Maher initiated the confrontation by meticulously laying out the historical predicate. He sought to remind the panel, and the audience, of the sheer unprecedented nature of the events following Justice Antonin Scalia's death in 2016. He recounted how a sitting president, Barack Obama, with nearly a full year left in his constitutionally mandated term, fulfilled his duty by nominating Merrick Garland. This nomination was met not with debate or a vote, but with a complete and total blockade orchestrated by Mitch McConnell, who refused to grant the nominee even the basic courtesy of a hearing. Maher, visibly agitated, relentlessly pressed Jennings on this point, framing the blockade not just as a political maneuver, but as a direct assault on the constitutional order, labeling it unequivocally as unprecedented and unconstitutional and illegal. He repeatedly cited the sheer audacity of this strategy, ignoring over a century of tradition for more than a year, motivated by nothing more than raw political gain. However, Scott Jennings, displaying the polish of someone clearly well rehearsed in defending this exact point, immediately launched his counter-offensive. He adeptly sidestepped the initial justification used in 2016, the flimsy argument that it was too close to an election, a rationale that Bill Maher correctly and dismissively labeled as bullshit. Instead, Jennings pivoted to what he presented as the higher, more sophisticated ground of constitutional interpretation. He insisted that the most current and intellectually sound defense rested entirely within the advise and consent clause. Jennings articulated a vision of this clause not as a procedural duty to vet and vote on a nominee, but as a grant of absolute discretionary power, arguing that it imbues the Senate with the sovereign right to determine how they consent, even if that method is to do absolutely nothing at all. Jennings further characterized the dynamic as a feature, not a bug, of a co-equal government. He suggested the Senate was not derelict in its duty but was, in fact, exercising its legitimate and constitutionally granted political power to check the executive. This, he implied, was a power that Bill Maher and his ideological allies only seemed to find offensive when it was being skillfully wielded by the opposition. The tension in the studio became palpable. Maher immediately attacked this line of reasoning, zeroing in on the glaring hypocrisy. He pointed out that when Amy Coney Barrett was rushed onto the Supreme Court, not just near an election, but during the voting process, even closer to the election than Garland had been, the very same political faction that Jennings defended suddenly discovered an urgent need to act. This, according to Maher, was the ultimate proof that the entire affair was purely situational, a cynical game of opportunistic power politics where principles were invented and discarded as needed. Scott Jennings, however, remained unfazed. He deftly turned the accusation of cynicism back upon the host, posing the rhetorical question of why anyone, especially Maher, would be against the exercising of political power. This linguistic judo move subtly reframed the entire debate. In Jennings's telling, those outraged by McConnell's actions were not principled defenders of the rule of law, but rather naive idealists, shocked and appalled to discover that politics is, in fact, a game of hardball. And this is precisely where the true, simmering, and foundational debate lies, far deeper than the transcribed words. If the Constitution, as Scott Jennings's defense implies, is not a document of guiding principles but merely a set of operational rules that permits partisans to seize whatever advantage they can get away with, then how can any citizen retain faith in the legitimacy of the system's outcomes? The unspoken controversy, the one that truly defines this moment, is that McConnell's single act, the blockade against Merrick Garland, succeeded in establishing a devastating new norm. It effectively transformed the judiciary from a co-equal, objective branch of government into just another political prize, a spoil of war to be won by any means necessary. Scott Jennings's polished defense does not just excuse this act, it solidifies and validates it, providing an intellectual framework that all but guarantees future partisan warfare over court seats will make McConnell's original maneuver look comparatively mild. Bill Maher's fundamental outrage stems from his belief that this, going outside the spirit of the law, ignoring the clear intent of constitutional guidelines, is the real crime. He sees it as the erosion of the very foundation of the republic, drawing a direct parallel to Donald Trump's dangerous rhetoric about a third presidential term. Another instance of treating clear constitutional boundaries as mere suggestions. The intense constitutional argument eventually found a brief, strange release valve. The conversation momentarily shifted, pivoting to the bizarre sideshow of Donald Trump's recent social media attacks on Taylor Swift, including the claim she was no longer hot. This digression provided a fleeting moment where Bill Maher and Scott Jennings found themselves on the same side. United in a shared political cynicism, they and Peter Hamby quickly concurred that celebrity involvement in elections, such as Swift's noted endorsement of Kamala Harris, often proves counterproductive. They referenced polling data indicating that while such endorsements shore up support among Democrats, they cause a striking drop in approval among crucial Republicans and independents, concluding that the public generally actually hurts candidates by getting involved. Bill Maher wryly speculated that Trump's attack was less about Swift's business viability, given her billion-dollar tour, and more about simple political sour grapes, or perhaps even a crude attack on her appearance. Scott Jennings, ever the strategist, stuck to the political theory of celebrity backlash. The ultimate, unaddressed controversy hanging over this entire tangent is whether the public genuinely dislikes celebrity endorsements on principle, or if the backlash is itself just another form of partisan signaling, booing the celebrity only when they endorse the wrong team. Finally, in the discussion's closing moments, the panel stumbled upon a topic of surprising and enthusiastic agreement: the concept of decentralizing the federal government. This idea, sparked by a proposal from Kash Patel to move agencies out of the D.C. bubble, received warm support from all. Scott Jennings, who personally lives in Kentucky and contributes to CNN from outside the Beltway, argued compellingly that Washington, D.C. has become far too concentrated, describing it as incestuous. He posited that this concentration creates an echo chamber where government workers only talk to each other and inevitably grow disconnected from the regular Americans they are meant to serve. Moving the Agriculture Department to Iowa, as was suggested, would, in his view, reconnect the bureaucracy with reality. Peter Hamby vigorously seconded this, extending the decentralization thesis to his own industry, the media. He noted that the most significant bias in major news organizations is often not political, but cultural and class-based, arguing for hiring more reporters in Des Moines and fewer in D.C. Yet, even this rare moment of unified consensus served only to sharpen the focus on the vast, unbridgeable chasm between Scott Jennings and Bill Maher on the show's core issue. They can find common ground on the geography of government, agreeing that power is damagingly concentrated, but they remain fundamentally at war over the philosophy of government. They are irrevocably divided on whether those who hold power should be bound by the spirit of the law and institutional norms, or whether they are free to wield raw, unconstrained political power until the other side simply cries foul. The debate between Maher and Jennings thus stands as the quintessential modern political standoff, one side decrying the calculated destruction of sacred norms, the other celebrating the effective, victorious execution of a brilliant strategy. It leaves the American public trapped in the middle, left to wonder which of these two philosophies will ultimately prevail in defining the future role of the Supreme Court and, indeed, the very nature of the Constitution itself. To truly understand the chasm that opened between them, one must look at the precise moment Scott Jennings staked his entire defense of Mitch McConnell. It wasn't a mere policy point, it was a foundational declaration. Jennings stated, with absolute conviction, that McConnell's undeniable legacy, a career spanning 42 years and 7 electoral victories in Kentucky, is unequivocally the Supreme Court. This assertion came not from a detached commentator, but from a man potentially in line to inherit that very mantle, lending a profound gravity to his endorsement of McConnell's tactics. Bill Maher, however, refused to let the what, the court, obscure the how, the method. He immediately seized upon the mechanics of the act, meticulously recalling the sequence of events with surgical precision. Maher reminded the panel of Scalia's death in 2015, and how President Obama, with a significant portion of his term remaining, nominated Merrick Garland. Then, Maher drove his point home, describing McConnell's blockade, a move he repeatedly stressed was unprecedented and unconstitutional and illegal, which denied the nominees so much as a perfunctory hearing. This specific act, the absolute refusal to hold a hearing, became the central fulcrum of the entire confrontation. Maher, clearly exasperated, leaned in and demanded to know what the latest bullshit argument was for justifying this action. Scott Jennings, stepping fully into his role as a seasoned political combatant, met the challenge directly, demonstrating his fluency in the evolving justifications. He acknowledged the initial, more porous arguments that had been field-tested, that the timing was too close to an election, or that it was a divided government, which meant the decision should properly fall to the American people. But Jennings didn't linger there. He quickly advanced his defense to its ultimate constitutional fortress, proclaiming that the true, unassailable justification lies within the advise and consent clause of the U.S. Constitution itself. Jennings posited a broad interpretation of this clause, suggesting it grants the Senate the ultimate, sovereign authority to determine the manner of their advice and consent. In this view, the process is not an obligation to hold a vote, but a potent political tool to be wielded by a co-equal government. Bill Maher would have none of it, emphatically branding this legalistic pivot as nothing more than the latest bullshit argument. For Maher, this was not the legitimate exercising of political power that Jennings claimed it to be. It was a fundamental subversion of the system itself. A clear and undeniable act of going outside the law. To illustrate his point, Maher stressed that the Constitution is a written document and is very clear, drawing an explicit and alarming analogy to Donald Trump's rhetoric about seeking a third term, another unambiguous constitutional boundary that Maher insisted must be respected at all costs. The irony, Maher noted, was palpable. He openly mocked Scott Jennings and the political faction he represents as being the very people who carry the little pocket constitution, yet seem perfectly willing to ignore its plainest text when it becomes politically inconvenient. Maher's position was simple. The Constitution dictates that a president gets to pick the nominee, and the Senate has to confirm them, implying a functional, good faith process, not a complete and total shutdown. Jennings, however, would not yield, maintaining his stance that the power dynamic defined by the Constitution allows the Senate to dictate the terms of engagement entirely. The exchange grew hotter as Maher pressed the obvious point of hypocrisy, reminding Jennings that if the roles had been reversed, if a Democratic Senate had attempted such a complete blockade against a Republican president, Jennings and his peers would have went apeshit about it. Jennings attempted to parry this charge by referencing the Bush years, asserting that he had personally lived through the period when Democrats in the Senate did everything they could possibly do to obstruct George W. Bush from putting judges on the court. But Maher instantly cut through that comparison, correcting Jennings by drawing a critical distinction. Obstructing district judges, while political, was one thing. This was a Supreme Court pick, a matter of generational importance. More crucially, Maher pointed out that even during the partisan battles of the Bush presidency, nominees were still given a hearing, and then the Senate voted on them. He even cited the historical example of Nixon's failed nominees, who received full hearings before ultimately being rejected. It was the total lack of any hearing for Garland, the refusal to even begin the process, that constituted the unprecedented transgression Maher found so unforgivable. The purely situational nature of this power play was laid bare when Maher introduced the case of Amy Coney Barrett's swift confirmation. Maher noted that her appointment occurred, even closer to an election, literally just weeks before the vote, which utterly demolished the too close to an election principle. Jennings, completely unflustered, simply redefined the entire context. We didn't have divided government then. We had unified government. This response was the smoking gun for Maher, cementing his accusation. It's situational for you, right? To which Jennings calmly agreed with the assessment, stating simply that they were just different situations. This seemingly minor distinction in framing, for Jennings, the difference between unified and divided government justifies two entirely different sets of rules. While for Maher, the core constitutional principle should transcend partisan control, represents the vast, unbridgeable gulf separating their worldviews. Scott Jennings continued to audaciously challenge Maher and all other critics. Why are you guys against the exercising of political power? From Jennings's perspective, McConnell's maneuvering was a strategic masterstroke, a brilliant and effective use of the leverage the Constitution provides. Bill Maher firmly countered that the exercising of political power is fine. But this is unconstitutional, and that's what we're against. This moral boundary, the bright line between political effectiveness and going outside the law, is where Maher drew his absolute, unmoving stand, the ultimate confirmation of the strategy's success. From Jennings's viewpoint, and the institutional damage, from Maher's, came when Maher recounted McConnell's own admission. When asked if he would do it all again, McConnell simply replied, "Sure." Jennings's entire defense, therefore, is rooted in championing a strategy that was fundamentally and wildly successful in altering the nation's judicial trajectory for generations, a fact that Jennings points to, without apology, as McConnell's greatest achievement. Even as the conversation briefly detoured from the high-stakes judicial battle to what seemed like lighter political fare, the underlying cynicism regarding political opportunism remained. The topic turned to Donald Trump's bizarre claim that Taylor Swift was no longer hot. Peter Hamby and Scott Jennings quickly found common ground, agreeing that Trump's attack was almost certainly a calculated response to her endorsing the other side, specifically mentioning her backing of Kamala Harris. They were not just guessing, they noted that people poll this stuff, confirming that when Swift made the endorsement, her approval ratings predictably went up with Democrats, but with Republicans and independents they actually went down strikingly. This led both Hamby and Jennings to a shared conclusion: the public generally don't like celebrities and politicians getting involved in elections. And that, far from helping, the involvement actually hurts the candidate. Maher and his guests then briefly dissected the nature of the public backlash, observing that the boos she received at sporting events were likely not a personal attack, but rather a visceral expression of the desire to keep football as one thing without Taylor Swift in it, a sentiment which Maher himself explicitly supported. And yet, despite the profound and heated constitutional disagreement that defined the night, the discussion concluded with a striking moment of alignment. Bill Maher, Scott Jennings, and Peter Hamby all found significant common ground on the idea of government decentralization, a concept sparked by Kash Patel's proposal to shutter the FBI's D.C. headquarters and scatter the staff across the country. Scott Jennings, who maintains his residence in Kentucky and flies to New York for his CNN contributions, was an enthusiastic supporter of the idea. He acknowledged that everything probably is too concentrated in Washington, diagnosing the capital as a little too incestuous. He argued forcefully that this intense concentration creates an insulating bubble where people only talk to each other, inevitably resulting in them having less in common with regular Americans. Jennings firmly believed that putting these federal employees out in the middle of the country would provide them with a little bit better understanding of how people are feeling about how their government's operating. Peter Hamby immediately expanded this decentralization thesis, applying it directly to the media industry. He suggested that major news organizations should incorporate more bureaus outside of New York, L.A. and Washington. Hamby contended that the most pervasive bias in media is less about overt political slanting and more cultural and class-based, arguing for the necessity of hiring more reporters in places like Des Moines and fewer in the Beltway. Scott Jennings's own personal life, flying up on Mondays for New York shows and then returning home to Kentucky, served as an implicit, living validation of this very need for perspectives rooted outside the coastal bubbles. However, this surprising island of consensus, this shared enthusiasm for decentralizing the federal bureaucracy, ultimately did nothing to bridge the fundamental, ideological chasm that had opened between Bill Maher and Scott Jennings. In fact, this brief moment of agreement only served to underscore the vast, unnavigable distance between them on the core, defining issue of the entire explosive conversation. They could find perfect, amicable agreement on the geography of the government, concurring that its intense concentration in Washington, D.C. creates a damaging, incestuous bubble that alienates it from the people it governs. But they remained fundamentally, and perhaps irreconcilably, at war over the philosophy of its power. Bill Maher looks at the political machine, the very one that Scott Jennings so capably and articulately defends, and sees an entity that has willfully broken the constitutional framework. He sees a cynical operation that, in its relentless pursuit of concentrated, generational power over the judiciary, has done permanent damage to the faith in the system itself. Conversely, Scott Jennings views that very same exercise of concentrated power not as a transgression, but as a masterful and effective wielding of the authority explicitly provided by the established rules of a co-equal government. For him, what Maher calls a constitutional crime was, in fact, a brilliant strategic victory, an achievement that rightfully defines Mitch McConnell's unparalleled legacy. The two men can agree on where the government's buildings should be located, but they remain locked in a mortal conflict over whether that government should be bound by the spirit of the law, or simply wield raw, unconstrained political power until the other side cries foul. This is precisely why Bill Maher's parting shot, delivered as the segment concluded, was so trenchant. He looked at Jennings, who had so skillfully parried every moral objection with a pragmatic defense of victory, and asked with a knowing look about his running schedule, pointedly inquiring, "Are you running for office?" This question, half joking and half deadly serious, served as the perfect bookend. It underscored the perpetual, cyclical nature of power acquisition that thrummed beneath every single argument that had been made. It was Maher's subtle acknowledgement that all these high-minded justifications and sophisticated constitutional debates are, in the end, often just the rhetorical tools of those who seek to acquire and hold that power for themselves. In the final analysis, the entire, fiery discussion served as a perfect, self-contained microcosm of the modern American political debate. It was the quintessential 21st century standoff, a visceral clash between those, like Bill Maher, who passionately believe the unwritten rules and institutional norms must be followed in spirit as the sacred bedrock of the republic, and those, like Scott Jennings, who believe the written rules are merely the boundaries of the playing field, within which the maximum amount of political power must be strategically, effectively, and ruthlessly deployed. It was a battle between the preservation of process and the celebration of victory, leaving the American public, as always, caught in the middle, left to wonder which of these two philosophies will ultimately prevail in defining the future of the Supreme Court and, indeed, the very soul of the Constitution itself.